Lisa Evers, and this is Street Soldiers.
Fox 5 and Hot 97 present Street Soldiers with Lisa Evers.
Hate speech is protected by the First Amendment, but does that protection end when inciting violence begins? That's at the core of a national debate as America rises to confront hate. The recent violence that erupted in Charlottesville began with a protest by white nationalists over the planned removal of Confederate statues. They had a permit for their initial demonstration, and no matter how offensive their message of white male supremacy and neo-Nazi views were to many, they were within their rights, says civil rights attorney Charles Coleman Jr.
Under the Constitution and the First Amendment, there's no distinction between what's hateful speech and what's loving speech, if you will.
The demonstration turned deadly when a white supremacist sympathizer drove his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing 32-year-old Heather Heyer and injuring dozens of others.
If speech is going to incite violence, that's when you've crossed the line of it being illegal. You can't advocate openly for violence against any particular group or person, and that's when you start going into the realm of what's illegal speech.
The white nationalists who displayed the Confederate flag, a symbol of slavery, were within their legal rights as private individuals. But the symbol still has a role in public institutions and government. It's part of the Mississippi state flag. Civil rights attorney Carlos Moore is fighting all the way to the Supreme Court to have it removed.
I do believe that the state or government actors should not be allowed to display images that celebrate slavery or advocate white supremacy. I believe that crosses the line, and I believe that's unacceptable.
Coleman believes Charlottesville is not an isolated incident.
Our ground has been fertilized to have this happen all over the country if we're not careful.
Many voices are predicting that the political climate will only become more intense. Let's take this to our panel and find out what they have to say. Joining me is Evan Bernstein. He's the regional director of the Anti-Defamation League. Evan, great to have you on.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being with us. Also with us is Charles F. Coleman Jr. He's a civil rights attorney and founder and executive producer of Black Brilliance 360. It's a web series. Charles, great to have you.
Always good to be here, Lisa.
Thank you. Also with us is Fred the Godson. He's a hip-hop artist from the South Bronx. Latest mixtape is Gordo. And thank you so much for being with us. We appreciate it. Charles, I want to start with you on this. Where do we draw the line between speech that is legal and illegal? Because a lot of people think what happened in Charlottesville went way too far.
So it's important to understand that under the Constitution, love and hate, or love speech and hate speech, if you will, are exactly the same. The Constitution doesn't differentiate between speech that we like versus speech that we don't like. And so there is no protection for hate speech under the Constitution, under the First Amendment. Now, there is it is unlawful to have speech that incites violence, speech that promotes violence, speech that encourages violence, particularly when that is geared toward any particular group or demographic. And I think that that's where the speech that was promoted in Charlottesville becomes problematic and where it becomes questionable. So, for example, it's not illegal to walk out and say white power or to say black power, for example. But if an angry mob of tiki torch carrying folks start walking around saying we need to kill all the blacks, that's, now we're getting into territory that's very, very dangerous, and that's where you start seeing a difference in terms of how speech is classified.
So it needs to be considered a little bit differently if that's the case.
Correct.
Evan, when you saw those Nazi flags right next to the Confederate flags, a lot of people were shocked by that. What was your reaction?
Unfortunately, we weren't that shocked at the ADL. We've seen a lot of the rallies and a lot of things we see online. A lot of times the Confederate flag and the Nazi flag or Nazi symbolism is unfortunately being equated together. The alt-right now, white supremacist groups have been using these imagery, for many, many years to kind of show themselves off for what they are and what they're about. And the oppressiveness of the Confederate regime towards slaves and what was taking place during the Civil War and pre-Civil War. In the Nazi regime, clearly with the extermination of the Jews and other minority groups are things that seem to be common links for these groups, and that's why they like those images.
And do they embrace the Nazi philosophy as well? The similarity is just the annihilation.
Yeah, I think it's about white power. It's about white supremacist, type thoughts and beliefs, and that there should be only one ruling group, and that anyone that doesn't fit into that should not have a seat at the table and should not be in a position of power.
Fred, what about the hip-hop response to this? Are people talking about this?
Yeah, they're talking about it. it's kind of crazy because what they're doing is they screaming the white power, and then they saying like kill us off. Like it's violent. Like with us, we'll scream black power, but we'll just like say why black power like means everything. Like to us, we're not saying black power F whites. You know what I'm saying? We're not doing that.
Right, it's like a self-assertion.
Yeah, it's just us trying to like bring up our people, but with them, it's crazy. It's like white power, and that's it. Like we hate y'all,
and we want to get rid of you.
we want to get rid. Like they want to not. Like they really want to kill us off. And I'm sitting there with my daughters, and I'm watching, and I'm like, oh, what? Like I never really seen it up front. Like I seen it in movies. I never seen the torches like now. Like I never
Right, like
seen
on
them.
the news, like happening right now in
Like,
our
right,
lifetime.
Yeah, in Virginia, like as it's going on, and it was shocking. It was like what's going on?
Evan, explain this for me, because if we show, when we cover a story of vandalism, and there's swastikas or there's KKK, we usually blur it on the news. But yet, if there's a march like this where they have these flags, they have these offensive symbols, they're making these chants that a lot of people were considering as threats of violence. Why is that okay? Or why is that allowed?
It's not, and it's, and that's where illegality, and I'm not an attorney, but I think it's, again, when that we're very much as an organization, as a civil rights organization, very much about free speech. But again, when it turns illegal, when it turns into potential violence, and the people's civil rights are being violated because of that speech, that's something that needs to be stopped. Symbolism itself is not illegal. People are allowed to, again, someone could walk on the street with a swastika T-shirt, and that's completely legal. It's all in context and whether or not you're going to be inciting violence or inciting something that's going to allow for people's civil rights to be violated.
Charles, what about what the legal community is saying? Because the Charlottesville example, that was not just right on the line. There were people that lost their lives and many that were injured.
Sure. The ACLU, for example, has caught a lot of heat because they have come out in defense of the individuals who organized the alt-right march, in terms of being able to actually do that, because under the Constitution and under the First Amendment, they do have that right. And I think that we have to be very careful in terms of how we sort of navigate that space, in terms of telling folks you can speak up, you can't. There's a group, Antifatia, or I forget how to pronounce their name. They're basically mobs of folks who are going around to college campuses when certain speakers are coming, particularly alt-right speakers, conservative speakers, and they're trying as best as they can to be disruptive and protest and eventually keep these people from speaking on college campuses. From a legal standpoint, I think that that's a bad move, because for someone like myself who's in civil rights, what happens when someone thinks that the speech that I'm saying in terms of being pro-black, in terms of black nationalism or Pan-Africanism or anything of that nature, is considered to be disruptive or considered to be problematic? I don't necessarily want someone censoring me. I think that when you start talking about the violence, that's a clear sort of example. I think what we're dealing with on a larger scale is, quite frankly, a reflection of our political climate, right? And I think it's also a lack or a failure of leadership by omission, or leadership by inaction, or leadership by indifference. Those are all failures that we've seen from the top down. And what it has done is it's fertilized this ground to create an environment that's ripe for this sort of thing to happen. I think that's beyond the legal ramifications where we really need to look to in terms of how this happened and whether it can happen again.
Fred, do you ever think, because there are times, they talk about everybody's entitled to get a permit for a march or for a demonstration. There have been times when there have been hip-hop concerts that haven't been able to get permits because they're like, we're concerned about public safety.
Yeah, I don't understand it. So it's like they're concerned about public, so they got a permit to do these things, and we just trying to, we just speaking hip hop, and it's, I mean, they say hip hop come with violence, but that's just, that's just something. But this is just mainly like, this is violent or out rip. Like, you got the symbols, and I understand it's freedom of speech. But what they spitting out their mouth with torches in their hands, like when you do that to blacks and the torches, what that reminds us of the KKK, and you're gonna burn things, and y'all marching the same way, and it's borderline crazy.
This is Street Soldiers. I'm your host, Lisa Evers. We'll be back right after this.
It's something that's very concerning to us. The alt-right is becoming very active in a way that has been unprecedented.
Evan, I want to talk with you about the climate, because at the same time that this happened, leading up to it, the first 6 months, 2017, record numbers of hate crimes and of complaints from people about outright discrimination based on religion, based on their ethnicity, their race. What do you say to that?
I mean, the climate has really changed during the election season, and I know we've talked about this before, but it's really, unfortunately, has not really changed. There's been a lot of times ebbs and flows of hate in our society or in our city, and really since the election season, it kind of jolted up, and then now it's been maintaining itself, and we're seeing more and more of it. And now we're seeing it in other cities around the country, and it's something that's very concerning to us. The alt-right is becoming very active in a way that has been unprecedented, online especially. They're going on college campuses now. This is something that's affecting young people, old people, small towns, big cities. It's a real problem.
And a lot of people are looking at it and really waking up. So, Charles, do you feel like racism is more? Because a lot of people are talking about our country is torn apart, but yet we see tens of thousands of people of all races coming together to march against this too. What's the reality in your view?
I think the reality is that we're just exposed to more. I think that the amount of racism that exists in the country is pretty much what it's been historically. I think that the resistance against racism and against systemic oppression has grown as people have been exposed to more information and sort of understanding how these things work. And intersectionality has been huge in terms of being able to build bridges and find commonalities among us in order to fight them. I think that one of the things that has happened is that we've steadily been seeing a sort of melting pot of a perfect storm brewing, and it may have started arguably with the election of President Obama. And since that time, I think much of white America, or a significant portion of white America, has sort of been seeing what they have viewed as their whiteness and what has represented threatened. And Donald Trump, quite frankly, has been the spark plug, or that has lit the fire and has continued up until last night when he gave his speech in Arizona, continued to fan the flames there with respect to not only the things that he said, but the things that he hasn't said, in order to calm things down, in order to really address the rhetoric that's coming from the alternate right and white supremacists.
Fred, do you feel like the climate has changed? Because you're out there in the streets, you're out there, you're working with a lot of different artists from a lot of different neighborhoods.
Yeah, it's changed, but it's really hard to feel it when you're in New York, because everybody mingles, But like my brother, he lives in Virginia, and he's like, "Yo, Fred, it's crazy out here," but he's been saying that, so it's like it's different. But like here, we all mingle.
What about these Confederate symbols? Because this whole Charlottesville thing happened over this Confederate statue that they didn't want taken down, Charles.
So there are so many different analogies that I could give in order to try to make this make sense, because the reality is, at this point, if you're ignoring it, you're willfully ignoring it on purpose, because everyone has the sort of same exposure to analogies and comprehension as possible. However, for those folks who have not been listening, imagine that the United States went to the Olympics, and imagine that the United States won 5 different Olympic contests, and they all took the gold. But for some reason, if you go back to the Olympic Village, for those 5 different events that we won gold, there were statues for the silver medalists and for the bronze medalists, but not for the gold medalists. The Confederacy lost. They lost. There's no reason to hold the flag up for the folks who tried to secede, and this is just sort of.
In other words, why? Like no one's trying to write that out of history, right?
Correct. I mean,
it happened, but why? You're saying why honor it?
The victor does not go. I mean, the spoils do not go to second place. They go to the victor, right?
Let me just bring in Evan here. When Charles is talking about these statues and these monuments to the losers, there's also equivalence with the Holocaust.
Well, if you go to Germany, you're not going to see a lot of statues of Hitler or Goering or Goebbels. And I think the other thing is too with the statues, these are not put up right after the Civil War. These are put up during Jim Crow. These are put out really one of the worst times in our history around race in our country, where we were still fighting with and struggling with how we're handling post-slavery America. And I think those symbols are put up for reasons to try to emboldened groups that were affected in their minds negatively by the loss of the Civil War. And I think it's imperative that we, as societies, look at these things and do everything we can to try to bring these things back, because they create so much hate. They really.
So you think we should really review, because in the city of New York, there's a 90-day review underway to look at the streets, the naming of the streets, to look at some of these statues and monuments. Charles, what about that?
I absolutely think that's appropriate. I think that, the argument, well, it's always been that way, is probably the worst argument that I've heard in terms of leaving them there. When you have information, when you know better, you do better. That's really what it boils down to. And I think that for so many people, they don't understand psychologically what it means to constantly sort of be reminded of the names of your oppressor, the names of people who sort of oppressed your ancestors, and sort of the systemic and structural institution that racism is and that white supremacy has been, particularly for oppressed peoples and peoples of color. So it's important that we do make those reviews. It's important that we do have these conversations. In some cases, it's important that we review how we are teaching history. So Evan and I were having a conversation during the break about how we've sort of sanitized Christopher Columbus into being this hero who discovered something that he did not discover, while also omitting the fact that he literally wiped out entire groups and races of people when he came to America and when he was exploring. So those are things that, we have omitted from history to our convenience and to the comfort of a very privileged
But is there a
group.
danger of looking at the past through the lens of today? Because in 2017, we're a lot more aware of a lot of things that we weren't aware of before. Is there a danger of looking back at the past?
The only danger that we have is getting it right.
Let's talk about what should happen from here on out. Charles, should we change? Do the laws need to be changed?
I think that in terms of laws, yes, we do need to re-examine, not necessarily with free speech, because I think free speech is important, but in terms of how we, and I've been an advocate for this for a while, how we're looking at hate crimes on the federal level, on a state level, how we sort of, what we are qualifying as a hate crime. I think that we need to reevaluate those. But I also think, are they being shortchanged in terms of the law? I think that they are being shortchanged in terms of the law. I think that the requirements are too stringent in terms of being able to qualify something as a hate crime. I think if you look across the country, New York has one of the more liberal policies, which is not a surprise, and it is a good thing in terms of this jurisdiction. But in terms of where these other things are taking place, your Charlottesville's, even in Boston, for example, some of the local laws around hate crimes are a little bit restrictive and are keeping white supremacists and other hate groups sort of insulated, because they may not necessarily run afoul of them with respect to their individual acts. So that's something that we definitely need to review.
Evan, what about in terms of there some people actually say, well, you know what, they're just about marching, they're just about having these extreme views, and there's little chance that they're actually going to impact public policy or change our lives. What do you say to people who have that opinion?
I think people can use their vote, people can use their voice, and I think, also like with Dylan Roof in South Carolina, and in some states having lack of hate crime laws, I think it's imperative that states get hate crime laws if they don't have them. And I think the biggest thing for us is the President of the United States needs to stand up to this and do it with a real plan. He needs to be able to give the FBI the kind of training that they need to be able to handle these kind of groups, work with the Department of Education to ensure that students across public schools across the United States are getting trained to understand that this kind of biased talk and behavior is not acceptable.
Fred, what about support for parents in terms of explaining this too, and how to teach this?
You have to show them. I mean, I'm just talking from
your heart, exactly.
Like if they was older, I think they will understand more. You have to show them the past and then show them what's going on now and explain to them why it's happening, why people's like that, because it's just hard.
All right, I want to thank all of you for being with us for this episode of Street Soldiers. Evan Bernstein from the Anti-Defamation League, civil rights attorney Charles Coleman, and hip-hop artist Fred the Godson. Thank you all so very much for being with us.
Thank you.
And remember, use your mind. It's your best weapon. I hope it's your only weapon. I'm Lisa Evers. Let's push for peace.